Hello, children. Here we go. This should be our last set of notes for the year. Don't get too excited. This will be, we'll be talking about elements of argumentation. Again, this is the second part, part one we covered earlier. This time we're talking about counterclaims and calls to action. Your last reminder that every time you watch one of these videos, they are required notes, and I do expect to see them. So I start us off with this little cartoon before I get into our objectives. We've got Calvin over here saying, I'll spout simplistic opinions for hours on end, ridicule anyone who disagrees with me, in general foster divisiveness, cynicism, and a lower level of public dialogue. And this is, this is meant to be ironic. Here's a kid saying, I'm just going to yell at people, and we'll just devolve into yelling at each other, and that's how we'll win arguments. And obviously that's not what we're going for in this class. So in order to avoid that, our objectives in this lesson are for you to be able to understand how to devise counterclaims and use them in your work. Counterclaims as opposed to just ridicule and calling people dumb, essentially, which is the kind of thing that's in this implied in this cartoon. You'll also be able to understand how to devise a call to action and meaningfully incorporate it into their work, so that once you have convinced people of your ideas, that they'll be willing to take your side. And finally, that's our last objective, is to incorporate these techniques in order to convince a skeptical audience of your ideas. Again, what we're going for here is a better way to talk to people rather than just to basically yell at them and call them stupid, which doesn't really work effectively to win arguments. Reminder that we've already really all year long covered how to argue for your own side. So the lessons listed below, they're all available. You can watch them. You should have notes on all of these anyway. They're all notes on how to convince people of or argue for your own side. This lesson's really about talking to the other side about their side and what they can do about their side and about changing their opinions. So the first step of this is to cover counterclaims, to have decent counterclaims, because counterclaims are for whenever you're having an argument and there's a section of the other side that is unwilling to believe what you're saying because they have other ideas. And that's really the underlying point here, and you can see it in this cartoon here. Calvin saying, I tell you, Hobbes, it's great to have a friend who appreciates an earnest discussion of ideas. Counterclaims are a good way to get people to listen to you when they're not on your side and to have that discussion of ideas. So step one is to acknowledge. Step one of any counterclaim is to acknowledge the other side. You can't just pretend it doesn't exist. And really, the way that you should do that is to not ignore, like I just said, don't pretend it doesn't exist. Don't ignore the opposition's arguments. Even if you disagree with them, even if you think they're the most ridiculous arguments in the world, you can't ignore them. And then you need to show an understanding of what the opposition is saying or what it might say against you. Again, even if you disagree with what they're saying, even if you think it's the most ridiculous thing or it's got false logic behind it, you really have to show that you understand where they're coming from. And that's step one of any counterclaim, is to acknowledge and show understanding. Step two then is the rebuttal. So once you have acknowledged them and once you have shown that you understand them, then you can rebut against them. This is for especially, again, when you think that their side is wrong and you think it's ridiculous, but you've already showed that you've acknowledged them, and now you can, take it to the next level. So the first thing that you should do in your rebuttal is you should provide cool-headed reasoning for why your side is more correct. This is not the time to just start yelling again, right? Like, it needs to be cool-headed. You need to be logical about why your side is more correct. You need to be able to integrate strong evidence that supports your reasoning or discounts their opposition, and ideally it should do both. Your evidence should support their reasoning and discount the way that they're opposing you. One thing to keep in mind, though, is as evidence becomes, as it pushes back against them, you have to stay cool-headed. You can't get angry just because they're frustrated by your evidence. You have to keep it cool-headed. So the last step of a rebuttal is to be nice about it. Even if you're providing evidence, if you're insulting them at the same time, it doesn't work very well, especially for the type of argument that we are talking about having for this particular project. The thing that you need to think about when you think about it is that many of these strategies that I've just given you are strategies that are helped by understanding rhetoric. And you should have at least a working knowledge of rhetoric, the 3 parts of rhetoric. If you look at the advice that I've given you here, we're talking especially about ethos and logos here, establishing yourself as some kind of authority and having the ability to talk about your side, but also having a logical way of approaching your side. That's not to say that pathos isn't going to play a role in this, but it seems to me, the way I look at it, that there's more ethos and logos here. We'll save pathos for the next slide. So after you have made your argument, you've laid out your ideas, you have hopefully convinced the other side of your ideas, you've provided your counterclaims in a way that's acceptable to them, then the last thing you're going to want to do is provide a call to action, and that's to empower your audience. Your audience being those people that you're trying to convince of your side. So you don't just want them to be convinced that you're right. You want them to feel that they can be a positive participant in your side. You want them to leave feeling as though this discussion or this evidence that you've provided is going to leave a lasting impact, a positive impact on them. And so, you want them to feel like Calvin and Hobbes here, going off to go exploring, right? Like you've opened up a new window into the possibilities of what they can do. And a good call to action is going to do that. So a good call to action does 4 things. The first of those things should be clear about your ultimate goal. So you should revisit your policy proposal. If you remember, policy proposals were in the first part of argumentation. You want to revisit that and just remind them that that's your ultimate goal, right? Number 2, you don't want them to tell them to do something. You want to describe to them how they can do it. So if you just say, okay, now go do this thing, they're going to feel powerless. They're going to feel lost. But if you say, here are some steps for how you can do this thing, for steps for how you can achieve your policy proposal, then they're not going to feel as lost. They're going to feel as though it's a capable achievement. The third thing that you want to do is you want to establish a sense of urgency. So you want to make them feel as though it's something they should do now, rather than, oh, well, I can wait. That's all well and good, but I have all these other things that I need to do. You really want them to feel as though it's the most important thing that they can do in this moment, is start participating in these steps that you've laid out. And finally, you want to make your audience feel good about participating. You want them to feel as though they're having a positive impact. You want them to feel those warm and fuzzies because they're helping, because you've convinced them of your side, you've convinced them that your policy proposal is correct and that they should participate. They're going to feel good about having changed their minds and now participating on your side. Again, if you think about it, many of these strategies are helped by, again, a working knowledge of rhetoric. And this is where I think pathos really comes in. We're talking about making people feel a certain way, feel as though they can do something, feel as they know what to do and how to do it. And so this is where really kind of strongly appealing to pathos, appealing to those emotions, tugging at those heartstrings is going to be have a positive influence on your argument. And with that, that wraps up our elements of argumentation. Have a good evening.